Central banks the world over are busy lifting interest rates and at the same time engaging in quantitative tightening. In other words, all those bonds they bought up, they're selling them back to the open market, or at least not buying any new bonds when they reach maturation. That means the size of the central bank's balance sheets will start to fall. Today, will that have any impact whatsoever on the economy? Well, it sort of depends on the kind of bonds you're talking about. That's today on the Debunking Economics podcast with Professor Steve Keen. I'm Phil Dobbie. Welcome along. Now, the balance sheet of the Federal Reserve, and this applies, Federal Reserve, of course, being the central bank in the United States, but this applies to many other central banks around the world. The balance sheet, which is the total assets they hold, particularly government bonds, so these are bonds that have been issued to cover government debt. That has risen in the United States with the Federal Reserve from just under $0.9 trillion in 2008 to not far short of $9 trillion today. Now, that is more than 1/3 of the total size of the US economy. But now, as they push up interest rates, central banks want to reduce this balance sheet. But Steve, if they do that, this is a triple whammy for the economy, isn't it? Because first of all, they're putting up interest rates, which is going to slow investment. So that's obviously not good for the economy, but that's what they want to do. Secondly, if they're unwinding the balance sheet, as we've talked about many times on this podcast, that's going to reduce the amount of money in circulation, because basically things that they've bought, they're pushing back into the open market, which is going to use money that's already out there. And thirdly, I mean, those high interest rates are going to reduce lending from commercial banks, which is another way that money is pushed into circulation. So it's going to constrain that amount of money being created as well. So you do all of those three things. What impact is that going to have on the economy? Because you are significantly reducing the supply of money and pushing up the cost of money at the same time.
Well, this is where you've got to be very careful about your accounting, and also when you're looking at the recipients of money, what can they do with that money? Because everybody has this automatic belief that the central bank can print as much money as it likes. Yes, but the question is, into whose bank accounts can it put that money? And the answer is only institutions which have an account at the central bank. And the answer for that is predominantly the banking sector, the actual banks, rather than the non-financial banking sector. But there is an exception, and that is when they buy financial assets of non-bank financial institutions. Yeah, and I don't know
which they have been doing as well, of course.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, that's the major factor. So if they're buying stuff off the banks, then what you've got is they're putting money into the reserve accounts of the private banks at the central bank, and then that money is turning up because when they're doing the buying of QE, so they put additional money into the reserve accounts of the private banks at the central bank, which is like the deposit accounts you and I, ordinary people, have at private banks. And on the other side of their ledger, they record they've got the additional bonds that have been purchased with those. So there's an increase in the amount of reserves in circulation, and an increase in the assets held by the central bank. But when you come down.
But it is impacting money supply, though.
No, this one is not. Okay.
Right. Okay. No, but I'm saying whatever they've done, however they've done, I'll allow you to continue in just a second. but the supply of money in the UK economy, okay, not to the same degree, because I talked about the balance sheet going from 0.9 trillion to 9 trillion, which is just astronomical in the a little over since 2008. But since February 2020, the money supply in the United States has gone from 15.5 trillion to 21.8 trillion. So something is creating extra.
Yeah, but that's not the central bank.
No.
Okay. So this is why one reason, if anybody wants to talk about what happens with money in future, I'm almost going to demand that they download a copy of my Minsky software and lay out the logic that they think is happening in a set of tables. And I think there's a certain radio broadcast that I think I've advised that to a couple of times.
I know. Who also plays devil's advocate, by the way, in these podcasts.
He does, yeah. Well, tell the devil to bring let God take over the keyboard and download a copy of Minsky and check this out, because we've got to go back and look at the central banks doing QE first of all, and what happens in their accounts is that they put additional money into reserve accounts of the of the private banks, and they have additional bonds which turn up on their books. That's where it rises from 0.9 to 9 trillion worth of bonds you mentioned earlier. That's where that comes from. Now, when you look at what actually happens on the private bank accounts, the accounts of the private banks at this stage, and I want to take one little general rule out of the example I've just given about what happens at the reserve at the central bank. The central bank has increased its liabilities by increasing its reserves, by writing up its book, entering effectively the number 8 trillion over time, 8 trillion into the reserve accounts of the private banks, and therefore recording 8 trillion of additional assets for itself. So its assets have risen, as you said earlier. But when you come down to the private banks, that 8 trillion is additional reserves has come at the expense of them selling nominally $8 trillion worth of bonds to the private banks. Now, the bonds of the private to the central bank. So the bonds that the private banks own are one of its assets. The reserves that the accountant has at the central bank are another one of the assets. It's been an asset swap. So there's been no creation of money because nothing has happened on the liability side of the private banking sector. And it's the liability side which is money.
So where's this money being created by then? Well, this from 15.5 to 21.8 trillion, where's that come from?
That's come from the Treasury.
Okay. Right. Okay. From overspending.
No,
basically.
No. Well, from necessary spending during a pandemic. Okay.
Sure.
If you're a conspiracy theorist, it might be overspending. But so far as I checked last time, we don't lay that lot onto the.
We're amongst friends here. Okay, by increased spending by the government. So that's why. So in other words, let's call it the deficit between how much they're bringing in tax and how much they're spending has increased by that amount, and that's why there's more money sitting in the economy. Okay, so what happens on the balance sheet at the central bank is irrelevant in comparison to that. It's just that they felt that they had to do that because, I mean, this is monetizing that debt, isn't it? They felt like they had to do that because there was a concern about if the government was issuing so many bonds, what would be the value of their bonds if there was a perceived oversupply of them in the market?
Well, but it's more complicated, mate. We haven't got through that yet because that I was talking about was an operation between the central bank and the private banks. Now, the central bank also can purchase things directly from the non-financial banking sector. Okay? They can. Yeah. A lot of the bonds have been bought from insurance companies, from pension funds, from hedge funds, etc. And there's
mortgage-backed securities. Chunk of them. Yeah.
Well, some of those are owned by banks, but a lot of them are owned by non-banks and actually issued by non-banks. And they were, I think, they were buying some original issues of bonds as well, not just on the secondary market. Now, when that happens, then there is an increase in the amount of money, but it's money that turns up in the financial sector in an institution which is legally obliged to buy with any money it receives, apart from paying its own staff. A pittance, the poor people are starving on the streets of Wall Street, as you would have noticed. But apart from paying their staff and taking profit and all the costs of running a financial institution, these organisations require with any money they receive to put that money into other financial assets. And so it's the spending, the money that's been created by banks ends up as excess reserves, and they can't do much with it because banks are required to have predominantly debt assets. They can't be buying shares and such. But the organisation like pension funds and insurance companies, of course, they do buy a portfolio. So what happens with that money that's created by buying government bonds, mortgage-backed securities, blah, 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 off non-bank financial institutions is that they find themselves with more cash and less assets, more cash assets and less financial assets. So that gives them an incentive to buy shares. I mean, that's why we've seen such an inflation in the share market over the last since the global financial crisis. Once they began quantitative easing, that was just pumping money in that ultimately, when it was purchased off non-bank financial institutions, either directly by the Federal Reserve doing it or indirectly by banks themselves buying off those institutions, buying bonds off those institutions where they're allowed to. Then you have a increase in the money supply circulating in the financial markets,
which is not particularly productive for the economy. So what happens when you hit the reverse lever and you start selling those bonds back to those institutions. We'll look at that in the full version of this podcast. To hear that, you need to become a supporter of Steve Keen on Patreon. Go to patreon.com/Prof Steve Keen, or you can subscribe at debunkingeconomics.com. Next time, we're looking at conspiracy theorists. That's going to be fun. Join us for that one. Thanks for listening today. Catch you soon.